My dear brothers and sisters, the topic for today morning's discussion is the two negations. It's based on two chapters of the book, rather the scripture by Aurobindo called The Life Divine. These two chapters come more or less at the beginning in book 1, chapters 2 and 3. Now what are these two negations? Negation basically means saying no to something. The first one of these is the negation that comes naturally to a person who takes this common saying, seeing and believing, very literally. If you take this very literally, then not only seeing is believing, you would feel that the converse is also true. What I cannot see does not exist. So this is one negation. What I do not see does not exist. So you are saying a no to whatever one cannot see. This is one negation. What is the second negation? The second negation comes from the one who has seen in the real sense, seen the highest truth, seen the widest reality. And in relation to that, he finds that everything else is so insignificant that even if one cannot wish it away, one can at least neglect it. And therefore, he says that that highest reality, the absolute reality, the infinite, whatever name you may call it by, is what is real. The rest is only an illusion or a dream or even a falsehood. So he is negating, in a way, what we can see. And this is the second negation. There is in fact some truth in both. And both can impact the life of the common man. And what Aurobindo has done is something which only he can do, and that is to reconcile these opposites. Now let's look at the background against which these can be both understood. That background is the Vedantic worldview. And briefly what that Vedantic worldview is, that the world is not an accident. It was created by the divine, who before the creation of the material universe obviously was a non-material entity, a non-material consciousness. And when it decided to manifest in the form of this material universe, it became the universe. It did not create the universe. There's a shade of a difference. It became the universe. It was capable of doing everything. One of the things it could do was to become the material universe, and that's what it did. Now, from this follows a very important corollary. If the divine itself became the material universe is nothing but the creator or the divine in another form. And if it is another form, then obviously it is nothing but the creator. For example, suppose a child starts with a piece of paper. A square piece of paper, he folds it and makes a boat out of it. And we ask the child, does this boat have paper? The child says, what a ridiculous question. The paper itself has become the boat. So every part of the boat is the paper. So in the same way, the creator became the creation, the creator became the material universe, and therefore every bit of the material universe is also the creator. But we don't see it. We don't see the creator or the divine in the material creation. And because we don't see it, we call it the spirit. So the creator has an all-pervasive presence in its creation in the form of its spirit. And that is why this worldview can also be called the spiritual worldview, because it believes in the all-pervasive spirit of the creator throughout the creation. Now, the initial thing created was material, or you can say dead matter. But then this dead matter was another form of the divine, and just think of the all-knowing, all-powerful divine becoming dead matter. What a fall. But then the consciousness or the potency, of knowing everything and doing everything did not really disappear. It hid itself in the creation. And the next thing that started was the process of evolution, in which what happened was that this hidden consciousness of the Creator started manifesting or becoming visible bit by bit in small steps in the creation, and in that there were some milestones. The first milestone was the appearance of the spark of life. So the creatures which were alive exhibited or manifested or expressed a little more of that hidden consciousness. Then came creatures which had a mind, and they could express that hidden consciousness even more. And the latest, although not the final, product of that process is the human being, who expresses the hidden consciousness of the divine, perhaps more than any other creature. But still, even human beings agree that they do not manifest that consciousness fully, because everybody agrees that basically we are half animal and half divine. So there's a long way to go before we'll come anywhere close to expressing the whole consciousness of the divine itself, the entire consciousness of the divine. We are long way from it. But the trend of evolution so far indicates that this process will continue, and man will give way to a creature which has the powers to manifest this hidden consciousness even much better than man. So this is the process of evolution about. But then man is unique all the same in the creation. Man is the only creature who has in him the urge to manifest more of this hidden divinity, and also the capacity to do it. And how can he do it? One of the simplest, safest ways of doing it is to live a life which expresses the Vedantic or the spiritual worldview. What does the spiritual worldview indicate? It indicates that although we are divided into so many, we as well as the rest of the creation, we are divided into so many, it is the one which has become these many, and therefore, in a way, we are all one. Just as all the apples which came from the same tree, they may be detached from the tree, they may be packed in a box, and they may all start feeling that I am separate from the next one. Not only I am separate, I am better than the next one. I am more red than the apple next to me, I am more sweet than the apple next to me, or I am bigger than the apple next to me. This is what the ego is about. So we may feel so, but all the same, basically we came from the same source, and therefore, at the deepest level, we are all one. If we are all one, then what is the corollary? The corollary is, if we are all one, then we love each other. So the way to express this worldview is a universal love. We start loving people around us. We start loving the creation around us, be it animals, be it plants. So that is the way to give a practical expression to this worldview. And since human being is the only creature who has the urge to do it, has the capacity to do it, and thinks in these terms, we can say that that is the unique purpose of human life. Now, against this light, let us try to see the two negations. First is the negation of the person who says that if I don't see it, it does not exist. And what do I see? I see matter. So that's why such a person can be called a materialist. And Aurobindo calls this the denial of the materialist, something that the materialist denies. What does he deny? He denies what he cannot see, or in a broader sense, what he cannot perceive with his senses, and what does not fall within the framework of reason. So these are the two basic things which the materialist is committed to, that I should be able to perceive it with my senses, and or at least I should be able to reason it out. Such a thing exists, the rest does not exist. Now this person depends on reason, but you will see that in the application of reason itself there is a flaw. When he says that if I see something I believe it, the opposite is not necessarily rational. If I don't see it, it does not exist, is not necessarily a rational conclusion. And even if he thinks a little deeply, he'll realize the flaw in this. I don't see the air, and yet I believe that the air exists. So how do I believe that the air exists? But all the same, this is essentially the stand that the materialist takes. And if we actually think about it a little deeply, we would realize that most of us are not very far from it. Although we may believe in the spirit of the Creator, we may believe in the divine, but then how do we live? Our life is organized primarily around the material reality. That is the way we live. So it means that by and large in our practical life, we are still giving an expression to this denial of the materialist. We live on the basis of what we can see and feel and perceive with our senses and what is rational and logical. That is the way we live most of the time. So much of our life is organized around this type of a picture of reality. So in that sense, we are all denying that spirit, the Creator, although we have some sort of a belief that it exists, some sort of even a vague perception that it exists, but then we keep it aside in one corner and live our life as if it does not exist. So essentially, we are all not very far from this denial of the materialist. And what are the consequences of this? How does it impact life? Strangely, this can lead to two opposite ways of living our life. Two extremes. One is the story of life begins with birth, it ends with death. That is the only thing I am sure about because that is the only thing I can see. What happened before that? Was there a previous life? What will happen as a result of my karma in the next life? What will happen after death? These things I do not see and therefore I don't bother about them. And therefore the dictum becomes, let me enjoy the life that I can see. So pleasure becomes the primary motive of life, and not only it may be the motive which appeals to the common man, it has also appealed to some great philosophers. Both in the East and the West, we have systems of philosophy like the Epicureanism, and in the West, and Charvaka philosophy in the East, which follow exactly this principle. This is the life that all exists. What we can see, obviously, the rest does not exist, and therefore might as well enjoy this life as much as you can. Whether the person can actually enjoy it is a different story. The fact that the princess kissed the frog, got her prince charming, and they lived happily ever after exists only in stories. Nobody lives happily ever after. But all the same, this person lives his life on the surface, and his life may be full of ups and downs. Sometimes it is bread eaten with butter and jam, and sometimes it is a traffic jam in which he is stuck. So whether it is one type of jam or the other, he negotiates both these and manages to live a life sometimes happy and sometimes not so happy, sometimes laughing and sometimes crying, but not really thinking beyond this immediate life. So this is one extreme to which one can go if one believes in the reality of only what we can see and what we can reason out. That is, the one who follows this dictum of the denial of the materialist can live this type of a life. But this very person can live another type of life which is just the opposite. He would say that, well, life begins with birth, it ends with death, it is such a short life, and experience has shown time and again to everybody that this life is full of ups and downs, they are inevitable, and that the greatest of happiness, the best of happiness comes from taking interest in people who are around me, in those who are around me, in creatures who are around me. That also does not require any belief in the divine. One can feel that pleasure, one can experience that joy which comes from love and service, and that far surpasses the happiness which comes from the bread which is buttered and and has jam on it, or you can say from sensory pleasures in general. It exceeds that happiness. So why waste this life on pursuing those fleeting pleasures, fleeting sensory pleasures? Why waste it on fighting others, competing with others? Why not spend this life loving and serving others, which will bring me great happiness? And this person can see that there are books written, history written. At least if I do that, I'll find a place in history. As they say, if you want to be remembered after death, either do things worth writing about or write something reading worth reading. Huh? So these are the two ways you can be remembered. So even if that little motive is there, this person who denies anything beyond the obvious, anything which is not seen or within the framework of the reason, this person can also come to a conclusion that the best life to live is a life full of love and service. Now contrast this with the same point of view leading to the conclusion that enjoy life, that is the end of life, enjoy it as much as you can. So both these are possible with the same. And therefore this point of view is not necessarily as bad as we think, and the fact that we are not, most of us organize our life around this, does not necessarily mean that we'll all be bad people. But then there is one more important implication of this point of view, and that has particularly shown in recent history during the last 400 years in the Western world, to start with in Western Europe, and after that also in North America. What I'm talking about is the European Renaissance, which led to the development of science and technology. The development of science was also based on exactly this point of view, that I have to trust only what I can perceive with my senses and which I can talk logically about. And Aurobindo has looked at this very sympathetically, because he feels that it did at least one thing, apart from, of course, accumulating a lot of knowledge which didn't exist earlier, and which also is a part of the truth. It may not be the whole truth, but scientific truth is also part of the truth. Apart from that, one more thing it did was to refine our intellect. This is not the first time in history that the intellect has been refined. We have books on the refinement of intellect in ancient India, like the Nyaya Shastra. And it's difficult to excel them, to surpass them. But in recent history, that is what the European Renaissance did. It sharpened the intellect, it purified the intellect, it refined the intellect, it taught us how to reason properly, and in that process got rid of a lot of dogmas and superstitions which had accumulated in the human race. So it helped us get rid of those falsehoods which were doing the rounds, being treated as something sacred, but they were essentially dogmas and superstitions. So science helped us get rid of those. But then Aurobindo has pointed out one very important thing, one more very important thing, and that is that this materialist's denial, although it is based on only part of the truth, that is the truth of the visible creation, carries in itself the seeds for its cure. It is a limited point of view, but it carries the seeds for its cure. Why? Because it has two types of restrictions. It has imposed on itself two types of restrictions, and sooner or later it will be compelled to give up those restrictions. One restriction is the restriction of the instruments that we use. It trusts only the senses and the intellect, which are not all the tools that we have for perception of truth. So it has restricted its use of the instruments. We have higher faculties which it does not trust, which it denies, in fact. Not only does not trust, anyone who gives any evidence of using any of those higher faculties like intuition is considered weird, if not insane. So the materialist who denies anything beyond the obvious does not have any respect for the higher faculties of learning, the higher tools that we have available. So it restricted itself in that. The second restriction because of this which it is imposed is the type of knowledge which we will consider to be true. Truth has no limits, but it considers only knowledge arrived at by this method of following the path of reason and trusting only the senses as true is itself an irrational way of looking at the truth, because it may not give us the whole truth. The whole truth may be much wider than this. And Aurobindo has anticipated what we can see very clearly. What will happen is that as the intellect is refined more and more, and as it is pressed into service more and more, and scientific knowledge grows, science itself will reach a point where it will start feeling that there is a layer of reality that probably science cannot fully explore. And science reached those limits around 100 years ago, around the time when Aurobindo was writing, and he could see it, that what will happen over the next 100 years. Because today, if you see, the latest findings in theoretical physics are consistent with the spiritual worldview, and the result is many physicists have started talking in terms of spirituality. The next to jump the bandwagon were the physiologists who showed many correlates, physiological correlates of spiritual experience. And the latest to jump the bandwagon perhaps are the clinicians, those who treat patients, doctors who treat patients. They have found that many modes of treatment which are based essentially on a universal consciousness can work. Because that is the basis of faith healing and the effect of prayer on healing, the effect of the healer's mind on the patient's body, and so on and so forth. Now, all these are things which are now at the fringe still, but now are becoming more and more a part of modern scientific medicine. So, science itself has started stretching its limits and started reaching those realms where it has started questioning the dogma that science itself had imposed on itself 100 years ago. So, as Aurobindo says that because of this, because of the insufficiency that it imposed upon itself, it will soon reach a point where it will start overcoming this limitation. So, this denial of the materialist contains within it its own cure. Okay? Now, let's go to the second denial, or refusal, as Aurobindo calls it. This is more than the denial, it's a refusal. Aurobindo is very precise in the use of terms. For the materialist, he says he denies something. For the ascetic or the rishi, he says he refuses to see something. What does he refuse to see? He refuses to see the material universe. He says that, yes, I can see it, but what is it? It is totally insignificant as compared to the vast layer of reality that I have seen, because this reality which people consider to be real, the materialist considers to be the only reality, this reality is short-lasting, always changing, it's perishable. On the other hand, the reality that I have seen is imperishable and constant. And therefore, that is the true reality. Now, he refuses to acknowledge sufficiently the fact that this material creation is also a manifestation of the divine. And therefore, it is just as real as the vast reality, the silent reality, the unmanifest reality, which he is calling real. It is just as real as that. It may be a partial reality, it may be a changing reality, but then all the same, it is that same reality. It does not make it any less. It may be short-lasting in its present form, but it is more or less eternal in its recurrence. And therefore, it is no less. But then, the basis of this refusal, Aurobindo has given through a very beautiful analogy, which I'll read out directly from the original. This page 17 in my edition of the Life Divine. There is attainable to us a consciousness yet more transcendent not only of the ego, but of cosmos itself, against which the universe seems to stand out like a petty picture against an immeasurable background. So the analogy he has given of the person who has reached this transcendent consciousness, that is the consciousness that transcends or goes beyond the ordinary picture of reality based on what is visible. So the person who has achieved this consciousness, how does he see? What does he see? What is the type of image that he sees? Aurobindo gives this analogy. He finds that against that transcendent reality, the universe seems to, that entire material universe, seems to stand out like a petty picture. Not only a picture, but a petty picture, an insignificant, ordinary picture against an immeasurable background. So, if you can see that immeasurable, infinite background, and on that is hanging one little petty picture, something like one little dot on a blank page, if you have a whole page and you put one full stop on it, you look at the page, you will not bother about the full stop. So that is the way this person is looking at the reality and therefore he's saying that this is I can refuse to see it. So this is the basis of the refusal of the ascetic. And in fact, the Rishi does go through a type of experience, and it is a very high level of experience in which he feels that the true reality is a silence. It's a type of nothingness. It's based on what the Upanishads call neti neti. Neti neti means this is not that, this is not that. That, referring to that absolute reality or the highest reality. So he looks at the wall and says, this is not that. How can this be that? So insignificant. This tree is not that. This animal is not that. This human being is not that. So this is also not that, that is all. So then what is that? What is that ultimate reality? If all this is not that, then that becomes a nothingness. And this justification which we have for this, Aurobindo provides again else on the same page a little later. And he says, if the materialist is justified from his point of view in insisting on matter as reality, the relative world as the sole thing of which we can in some sort be sure, and the beyond as wholly unknowable, if not indeed non-existent, a dream of the mind, an abstraction of thought, divorcing itself from reality. So far, Aurobindo has described and justified the way the materialist looks at the universe, the denial of the materialist. He has expanded on that the materialist may be justified in considering this world which is only relative to that absolute reality, considering that relative reality as the sole thing, that is the only thing, because that is the reality we can in some sort of way be sure about. And then what does he think? That even if a beyond exists, even if something exists beyond this, he considers that as wholly unknowable. That because we cannot know it through the senses and through reason, it is unknowable. That is what an agnostic is about. It is unknowable, if not non-existent. So if he is very rational, he'll say, well, it may exist, but at least it is unknowable. And therefore, he dubs it as a dream of the mind, an abstraction of thought, divorcing itself from reality. So just as the materialist is justified in adopting this type of point of view, so is the rishi or the sannyasi in adopting another point of view, and now he gives the justification for that, the refusal of the ascetic. So also is the sannyasin. So also the sannyasin also has a justification. So also is the sannyasin enamored of that beyond, justified from his point of view in insisting on pure spirit as the reality, the one thing free from change, birth, death. So why does he think that that is the sole reality? Because that is the reality which is free from change, it is constant, free from birth and death, it is not born, it does not die. So that reality which is free from these limitations is the true reality. So the sannyasin also has a justification. So just as the materialist has a justification, so also is the sannyasin enamored of that beyond. Enamored of, he's gone into an ecstasy. He has seen the glory of the beyond. He has seen the vast expanse of the beyond. He has experienced the silence of the beyond. He has experienced the immeasurable nature of the beyond. And therefore, enamored of that beyond, he is justified from his point of view in insisting on pure spirit, that is that pure spirit which is not manifest, the spirit of the divine which does not manifest even. He is insisting on pure spirit as the reality, the one thing free from change, birth, death. Because even in the manifest reality, it is the spirit which is changeless and deathless. What we call in the individual, the soul. The spirit is universal, the soul is individual. That is the only difference between the spirit and the soul. So the spirit is immortal, the soul is immortal. So that the ascetic can acknowledge. But the changing part of this phenomenal reality, phenomenon is something which has a beginning and an end. So the part of that phenomenal reality which is subject to change, which is not constant, which is born and which dies, that he refuses to accept as anything significant. And if it is not significant, then how does he dismiss it? And the relative as a creation of the mind and the senses. He said this is just a creation of the mind and the senses. the mind and the senses are just as illusory, as insignificant as the creation itself. Because so a creation of the mind and the senses, a dream, an abstraction in the contrary sense of mentality, withdrawing from the pure and eternal knowledge. So he considers it as, just as the materialist said that seeing anything beyond is an abstraction of thought, the ascetic considers the material reality as an abstraction in the contrary sense. So this is also an abstraction from the same intellect. But then he says it's an abstraction. How does it result? Of mentality withdrawing from the pure and eternal knowledge. When the human intellect or human mentality decides to withdraw from the pure and the eternal knowledge, then it feels that this visible reality is the real reality. Now, just as the materialist point of view had a certain implication for daily life, and we saw it can lead to two extremes: living life just to enjoy it, or living a life of love and service. What is the implication of the refusal of the ascetic? Because while this way of looking at reality may be restricted to a few rishis, it gets transmitted to the general public, and it leads to a certain way of life for everybody. And that is the type of implication it has had particularly for India during the last 2000 years. Before that, the way of looking at Vedanta was one which encompassed the entire reality as true, including the manifest reality, and therefore we did not reject the world and worldly life. We had a vibrant worldly life, and spirituality permeated it. But around 2000 years ago, started setting in a different point of view, which was closer to the refusal of the ascetic, and we started feeling that all this visible reality is only an illusion, and one step further, it is a falsehood, and therefore, although we are enmeshed in it because of various compulsions, obligations, and responsibilities in the world, the real thing is beyond all this, and probably we'll be able to reach it only after death. So death was looked upon as an escape from this morbid reality with which we have to grapple throughout our life because of our ignorance and because of our compulsions. So that is the way we came to look at it, and the result was a dichotomy between worldly life and spiritual life. So while spirituality permeated worldly life in the Vedic times till about 2000 years ago, around 2000 years ago began a process of dichotomy between worldly life and spiritual life. Because our civilization goes back to more than 5000 years ago. So for 3000 years, when spirituality permeated daily life, India was second to none in the world in both spiritual matters as well as in material progress. In fact, the momentum of this continued for another 1000 years. Even till 1000 years ago, India was second to none. It was a very prosperous nation, and that is what attracted the invaders. And it was a prosperous nation and second to none even in science and technology, be it mathematics, be it medicine. In all these areas, we were second to none till about 1000 years ago. And then, by then, this degeneration, which started because of the dichotomy between worldly life and spiritual life, set in. It started affecting our worldly life. We started feeling that worldly life is one thing and spirituality another. So we pushed spirituality to one corner and thought that observing some religious rituals on special occasions is all what spirituality is about. And the worldly life became material, and we started living more like the materialist who says that the purpose of life is to enjoy it. So we started living like that, and that was the degeneration which set into worldly life, which led to the invaders becoming successful and our enslavement. And slavery further accelerated the degeneration. So that is the light in which we can look at the history of this country for the last 2000 years. And that is why for us it is important to understand that true spirituality is not rejection of worldly life, and it is not rejection of the spiritual worldview. It is the reconciliation of the two, bringing spirituality into worldly life, which is the key to both living a purposeful life, a meaningful life from the spiritual point of view, and also a life which will lead to material prosperity and progress. So that has been the bane of the Indian psyche, particularly for the last 1000 years. Started developing 2000 years, but for the last 1000 years, accelerated further by slavery, this has been the dominant way of thinking in the Indian psyche, and that's why I'm sure many of those who are listening to this can easily identify with this, कि हम तो इस माया जाल में फंस गए हैं, आँखों का धोखा है, असली लोग तो वो हैं, अक्लमंद तो वो हैं जो इस दुनिया को छोड़ के भाग गए, किसी जंगल में चले गए, किसी गुफा में चले गए, और वहाँ जाके असली जो चीज़ है उसको ढूंढ रहे हैं, उसको पा रहे हैं. हमारे लिए तो बस एक ही रास्ता है, मोक्ष प्राप्त करें, शायद जो मृत्यु के बाद प्राप्त होगा. बट वॉट इज़ फॉरगॉटन इन दिस प्रोसेस इज दैट nowhere does this Vedantic worldview say that automatically one would get that release from coming back to this world. For that we have to live life in a particular way. That is what we forget. We feel as if somehow if God will be kind to us, we'll pray a lot and He'll then never send us back again. We have to live this life in a certain way. And what is that way? That is the way of realizing that oneness which will give rise to love. Which means that even if we are a materialist, from that materialistic denial, if we choose to live a life of love and service, that will give us that so-called escape from coming back to this world, not just living life like that materialist who says enjoying life is the only way. So that is what we forget sometimes. That while, even if we accept that moksha as the ultimate aim, that moksha will not come just like that. We'll be brought back to this life again and again, brought back to this world again and again and again. That is the Vedantic worldview. Even the worldview of those who have taken the route of refusal of the phenomenal reality. Even they have accepted that repeated rebirth is the rule. The exception, that is when we will not require to come back again and again. That exception will take place only after multiple births, when one has reached a certain level of spiritual evolution, and for that one has to live life in a certain way. So how we live is compatible with that materialist who lives a life of love and service. It is compatible with the person who accepts the spiritual worldview, but then interprets it in a way that he does not reject the world, treats the world not as an illusion or a falsehood, but treats the world as a manifestation of the divine, and lives in such a way which gives an expression to this worldview by living a life of oneness, which in turn will inspire love, and which in turn will lead to an expression of this love by giving what we have to those who need it. So that is the way which will give us even that so-called escape, so that we don't have to come again to this world. Now, out of these two refusals, now it is obvious which is the one which is more dangerous, which leads to worse consequences. As we saw, the denial of the materialist need not necessarily make a person bad. It may make it difficult for him to understand that if I am living a life of love and service, then why do all these sorrows and sufferings come to my life? He may find it difficult to understand that. But he can live a life full of love and service, even denying anything beyond material life. And further, this denial carries in itself the seeds of its cure, and therefore it's not very dangerous. More dangerous is the refusal of the ascetic, because he thinks that I know what is there to be known. There is no reality beyond that, and therefore there's nothing more to be known. There's no correction that I have to apply. Therefore, that in fact is more dangerous, and that is what the Isha Upanishad says in its 9th verse. Andham tavah pravishyanti ye avidyamupasate tato bhuya evate tamo ya u vidyayam ratah. Andham tavah pravishyanti ye avidyamupasate. In darkness live those who follow ignorance, avidya. In darkness are they. This is easy to understand. The next is the intriguing line. Tate bhuya evate tamo yau vidyayam ratah. In greater darkness are those who have the vidya, who have the knowledge. Now, how can the person having knowledge be in a greater darkness? It is because the one who is ignorant and therefore he is in a darkness, at least there is a hope that one day he will get the knowledge and his ignorance will be removed. And therefore the darkness will be removed. In greater darkness is he who has the knowledge, because he is confident that I know what is there to be known, and because of this complacency, because of this smug satisfaction, because of this feeling that I know everything that there is to be known, there is not even much of a chance that he will be able to get out of this darkness. And why is he in a darkness? Because while he is looking at a very vast and infinite reality, he is also rejecting a certain part of the same reality, and that is the manifest reality, because he is forgetting that that is also a manifestation of the same. So that is why he is living in a greater darkness. But then the two can be reconciled, as we have seen. Reconciled in the sense that one can move from the denial of the materialist to a greater realization of the spiritual worldview. And that can be done if we live a life which is lived well, engaging with worldly life. And that will help us move from the denial of the materialist towards a greater wisdom, a higher and deeper knowledge, and at the same time help us avoid the pitfall of the refusal of the ascetic. Now, Aurobindo, again in his inimitable way, says that this reconciliation is different from a compromise. Very important and precise language. Because a compromise is making a mutual concession. If there's some opposition between 2 points of view and you make some concession to each other, chalo thodi baat मैं तुम्हारी मान लेता हूँ, अब मेरी बात थोड़ी तुम मान लो. That is a compromise. This is not mutual concession. Reconciliation is a mutual comprehension. Understanding the other point of view. So that is what he does in these 2 chapters, the denial of the materialist and the refusal of the ascetic. He understands both, points out the flaws of both, points out the justification of both, and then shows us how to reconcile the two. So it is through this mutual comprehension that we can reconcile these apparent contraries. Not only these, but any contraries in life. They require mutual comprehension, because a compromise reached through mutual concession is always temporary. It is only reconciliation which comes through mutual comprehension which is lasting. And that's why to understand this is a general principle also which Aurobindo follows everywhere is very important. So that is what these 2 negations are. The denial of the materialist and the refusal of the ascetic. Both right in their own way, but both with their drawbacks, limitations and pitfalls. And the important thing is that while these are ideas that have been born in the minds of great thinkers, philosophers and sages and rishis, they percolate down to the general public and impact the life of each one of us ordinary persons. And that is why it's important to understand this. And if you understand this, I'm sure we can live a far better, happier, healthier and more meaningful life. Thank you.